Well, good evening, everyone. So my name is David Caron. I serve as Dean of the Law School. It's my privilege to serve in that capacity and to welcome you here this evening. Now, the occasion tonight to call you all together is the publishing of a book, and it's by a new member of our faculty, Dr. Megan Bowman, and the title is Banking on Climate Change, How Finance Actors and Transnational Regulatory Regimes Are Responding. That's nothing wrong with the title. It has to do with my handwriting, that I stumbled there for a moment. Our tradition is not that we just discuss the book, but we use the book as a way of launching into a discussion of the topic, which is so timely before us. As I no doubt we'll hear tonight, talks are about to resume in Paris on negotiating a response to mitigate climate change. It's always struck me when I think of negotiation theory, normally you sit down and you try to think of the interests of various parties and how one might come to a solution. In a negotiation about climate, one actor is the planet itself, the mechanism of climate. It does not reveal what it wants out of the negotiation. It refuses to negotiate. Everyone then pretty much ignores the fact that the planet is in the room, setting the terms of what is needed, and then to proceed to talk as though they will somehow come to a deal with this unresponsive participant in the negotiation. Once you look at it this way, then you see the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, as primarily a way to interrogate the non-responsive member in negotiations and find out what is at stake. I've always had some hope for the private actors that maybe somehow the private hand of the market, the invisible hand of the market, would somehow lead to more responsiveness, some incentives to deal with that. And so I very much look forward to the discussion tonight. We've come up with a great little way to get into this topic. We're going to have an address first from Mr. Justice Blair, who I'll introduce in a moment. And then we're going to turn it over to the panel, moderated by Megan Bowman herself, and she will introduce the panel. And we'll go to about 7:30. That'll include questions, and then we'll continue on with some wine and appetizers. Our main remarks on the book and on the topic are given by Mr. Justice Blair. He was appointed a High Court judge in England and Wales in 2008 and sits in the Commercial Court. From January of 2016, racing toward us, he will be judge in charge of the Commercial Court. Before appointment as a judge, he became a QC in 1994 and was chairman of the Commercial Bar Association between 2003 and 2005. Importantly for us tonight, he has traveled widely, been active in international financial issues, participated in missions for the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and the Asian Development Bank, and is, among other things, a member of the Academic Advisory Board of the Asian Institute of International Financial Law. He's a visiting professor at the London School of Economics. I'm happy for that strength in one of our sister institutions. He has volunteered quite generously to come lecture again on a topic, and we look forward to that. Mr. Justice Blair, may I invite you to offer some remarks.
Well, David, thank you very much indeed for those kind remarks. And I'd like to say what a huge pleasure and indeed privilege it is to be at the Dickson Poon School of Law at King's College London. And of course, it's a particular privilege to speak at an event centering on Megan Bowman's book, which, as the Dean has said, is banking on climate change. And I should, I think, perhaps say that actually, I am the warm-up. There's going to be a panel of experts later. I think it is quite remarkable that in a way, we're meeting in the context of a law book in a leading law faculty on the very afternoon when I forget how many, it's 149 heads of government and heads of state have been making their presentations in Paris. There are so many of them that they have to split it between two rooms, one named after the River Seine and one named after the River Loire. And I must say, it did occur to me that if this process goes on much longer, then it's perhaps fortunate that the French have got quite a few rivers in reserve. But it is timely. And it struck me as well, as someone who has specialized in the law of banking and finance for a long time. As I think everyone realizes, we had a sort of huge global issue in 2007 and 2008, the global financial crisis. But I can't think of another issue that has really got people together at such a high level as climate change has. And I'm sure that's because, first of all, it's elemental, but secondly, it's long term. And that's something I'd like to come back to if I may. I was introduced to Megan and Edith work by Professor Ross Buckley of the University of New South Wales. And when I saw Megan in May of this year, she told me she'd been appointed lecturer in law here at KCL, and I must say, if I may say so, this demonstrates just how much under the leadership of Dean David Caron, this School of Law is really at the forefront of what is happening in the law today. Now, I actually have got a copy of the book, so I'm as you can see, well equipped. But I'm going to focus on what is in fact the subtitle of the book, which is How Finance Actors and Transnational Regulatory Regimes Are Responding. And that's going to be my the subject of my brief remarks. I'd like also to perhaps say a little bit, not just about finance actors, but because we're lawyers in a legal environment, to say something about how the law may have a part to play in whatever may be agreed in Paris, and I think we all hope and probably, I think, as I was saying to Megan earlier, with reason this time, that they will reach some kind of agreement in Paris, and as you all know, they've restructured it in a way that may well make agreement more likely by having the leaders first, not at the end, and that I hope will pay dividends. Let me frame my remarks in this way. Since the global financial crisis of 2007 to 2008, a major concern of central banks has been financial stability. Picking up on a conversation I had earlier this evening with Megan, in a speech which the Governor of the Bank of England gave on the 29th of September, and by the way, the Governor of the Bank of England is also the chair of the Basel-based Financial Stability Board, which has a coordinating role in financial regulation globally. In his speech on the 29th of September, the Governor was addressing Lloyd's of London, the insurers, and his subject was climate change. By the way, just by way of an aside, the Bank of England had a very successful open forum on the 11th of November. I was lucky enough to be on the organising committee, but we had a session on social license for finance. It wasn't specifically to do with climate change, but you can kind of see the direction that institutions such as central banks may be taking as they look at their responsibilities and try to see them in the round. But anyway, what the Governor said by way of connecting these two issues, financial stability and climate change, was this. He said, we don't need an army of actuaries, he was talking to insurers, of course, to tell us that the catastrophic impacts of climate change will be felt beyond the traditional horizons of most actors, imposing a cost on future generations that the current generation has no direct incentive to fix. Well, I mean, in a sense, that's a sentiment that has been expressed in different ways many times. But what I think was interesting was his point about horizon from the perspective of this leading financial actor. The horizon for monetary policy, that is setting interest rates, he said it extends out to 2 to 3 years. For financial stability, it's a bit longer, but typically only to the outer boundaries of the credit cycle, and he put that at 10 years. In other words, he said, once climate change becomes a defining issue for financial stability, it may already be too late. Now, he had no more magical solutions than any of us have. We are axiomatically in a subject area which is notably short of magic solutions. But, and this is a connection I'd like to make with Megan's book, he did make the point that others have made about the importance of information. Better information leading to better decision making, and that is as true in finance so far as it relates to climate change as anything else. So finance, trying to see how this fits into the picture. Megan explains in the book that really you can look at finance in this field of climate change at two different levels. The first, if you like, is the finance sector as partial enforcer, and that's a slightly crude way of putting it. But the point is an insistence on climate-friendly conditions attached to project finance. I know those of you in the field will be familiar with the Equator Principles. They're described in the book. I remember speaking about them, Megan, in 2006 at Freshfields organised an event. I thought they were far-sighted then, and I think they're far-sighted now. And of course, in a sector that gets its fair share of justifiable criticism, these were things it did before the crisis, and I think it's entitled to some credit for that. Let me just, perhaps by way of update, say that the first African bank to chair the association was appointed earlier this year. That's Standard Bank of South Africa. That will chair the association between 2015 and 2016. And in September, the first bank in the United Arab Emirates to sign up to the Equator Principles, the National Bank of Abu Dhabi, did so. There's some very interesting discussions, by the way, in the book about how far this kind of approach really produces results. I'm not going to say much about that. It's something maybe we could go to in the panel discussion. But anyway, that's the first level. The second level, which is very important and deeply granular, has to do with funding. And the amounts required, of course, to transit to a lower carbon economy are large. I sometimes think there's a competition for, who can think of the most zeros. I mean, there are quite a few of them out there. You've written on this, Megan, in the Harvard College Review of Environment and Society recently, and I think quoted World Bank figures, and they're probably as accurate as anything else, but the point is it's obvious that a great deal of money will be required. And a key point in the book, and something I think we need to very much get our minds around, is that much of this is going to have to come from the private sector. And I would say this from my own experience in the field, looking forward 1 decade, 2 decades, and how the banking sector may change over time, a lot of changes already. This kind of money will certainly not only come from banks, and in fact it is likely it will not mainly come from banks. And issues as to funds, investment funds, huge pools of capital, how these may play their part, and how you unlock that capital. This will be a major issue. And a point that Megan makes in the book, which I agree with very much, is that it is important to try to focus clearly on the business case for doing this, because that's the most likely way of actually crucially unlocking that door. There may well be a challenge, I think, in defining what do we mean by sound business case. And of course the law comes in here. Shareholder value as an indicia of corporate capacity, although not an exclusive one. And this is a very important point in, for example, the recast UK Companies Act of 2006. There was a requirement for directors to have regard to the impact of their decisions on the environment, and this may be something that has yet to be fully explored with the courts. So the law, and what I had in specifically in mind was not so much the huge body of law that there is already, and I gather you had a very interesting conference here recently of chatting earlier to you of judges and others internationally who'd been deciding cases in this field. And I mean, I was really interested to hear you had the judge from Pakistan who decided the case earlier in the year. He was a Lahore judge, as I recall, about requiring the government to, I forget exactly what it was, but set up some kind of commission. We had it in Delhi with the Supreme Court some years ago. I'm not going to get into the kind of activist, non-activist debate, but I think you can see judges feeling that if they don't do something, then no one will. And this, I think, is something that is going to vary a lot from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. But let's just focus for a little bit on what kind of agreement might emerge post-Paris and how the law might come into that. One of the things in the financial field that's currently attracting a lot of attention is the effectiveness of the law and how you do this best, and in particular the interplay of hard law, soft law, and standards in finance. And this is not restricted to financial regulation, of course. It's a feature of regulation generally. I didn't mention this, David, but I chair an informal law and ethics in finance project, which has had the generous support of our Chief Justice. And this is the kind of thing that we're interested in analysing. And to pick up an important discussion in the book, Megan compares the concept of must, which is a concept that has attached to it legal sanctions, with the concept of ought, which really has to do with aspirational principles like the Equator Principles, that kind of thing. Sometimes we have to appreciate, I think, that the differences between the two in practice may not be as great as appears because, as she points out, breach of aspirational standards may attract severe reputational sanctions, which can be just as, if not more effective than fines by courts of law. Also, and I think this is important, you have to get the ought right, and you have to get consensus of the ought before you can get to the must. Anyway, I would suggest that implementation of any Paris Agreement is going to involve hard and soft law, and picking up the phrase you use in your book, which I think is a very good one, empirically informed regulation, shades there of Governor Carney and his emphasis on information, but also there's got to be a space, I think, for principles which encourage and inspire but do not directly bind, because these are principles to which you hope people will reach, even if they're not legally obliged to. And very important so far as the law is concerned, regulation must not hold back innovation, and that is an absolute requirement in this field. Now, there's much more I could say if there was more time, but I'm just going to mention one other thing, if I may, before handing over to the panel. This would not be a 21st century book by a 21st century Australian if China was not mentioned. And it is. In fact, there's a whole chapter on it, am I right?
Yes.
Yeah. And a very good chapter as well. And we're all interested in this, and we're right to be. China, as she says, is going to be in so many ways the crucible in which whatever comes out of Paris will either succeed or will fail. And that, I think, is a simple statement of fact. Let me, since you've given me the kind of financial brief, just mention something a little different, if I may, which I think is also important. China is also playing an increasing role in international infrastructure development, as opposed now to a domestic development. There's the Bank of the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. But the one definitely this year that has attracted all the attention is the launch of the Asian Infrastructure Development Bank, the AIIB. And that was of interest in this country because this country became the first, effectively, Western developed country to sign up for it. And as a result, a lot of other countries followed, though not the United States. So how is China going to deal with this? And your expertise here is far greater than mine, but I would say that there has been a change, and we can hope now that China will take a leadership role, because it really has to. I mean, it doesn't have a whole lot of option, is the truth. I picked up, and this is the last thing I'll say before sitting down, something on the internet by, in fact, from it was published in China Daily on the 27th of November, so just a couple of days ago. Now, this was actually written by the Director General of Independent Evaluation at the Asian Development Bank, which, as you know, is based in Manila, a very good institution, by the way. But the point is that here's somebody from the ADB talking about these Asian infrastructure banks, talking in the Chinese papers, and what he said, was pick it out, is this: the public sector has a vital regulatory and enabling role, while the private sector has more investable capital at its disposal. And then another thing that, when I was in Beijing in April at the People's Bank of China, we had a discussion on this subject: public-private partnerships done right can help expand infrastructure. And then, but for infrastructure investments to have lasting value, all stakeholders in infrastructure programs must take to heart the priority for climate mitigation and adaptation. The crucial question is how official and private financing can make infrastructure climate harmonic. So that's all I want to say. I warmly welcome your book. It is a fine contribution to a really central debate, and I'm looking forward to listening to the panel discussion now.
Thank you very much, Mr. Justice Blair, and thank you very much, Dean Caron, as well. And thank you, all of you, for coming tonight. I'm still getting used to the London weather. I don't know if you are, so I appreciate that you braved what is probably utterly mild, isn't it? Yes, it's utterly mild, but I appreciate that you braved it to come here, so thank you. Thank you particularly, Mr. Justice Blair, for those very generous comments and for those timely observations at this time in relation to these two areas coming together that have not been traditionally happy bedfellows or even remotely associated with each other. So the point of this part of the evening, this panel discussion, is really to broaden the discussion out into the here and now and into practice with particular expertise. And the UK, actually, it's just wonderful, just such an amazing place to be here at this time, particularly discussing these issues. So, for example, just in the last 12 to 18 months, the United Nations Environment Programme has created and indeed released its ultimate report just two months ago on the inquiry into a sustainable financial system. And that report was actually headed up, that whole inquiry was headed up by a man called Nick Robbins, who was head of the Climate Change Excellence Centre at HSBC at the time that I was doing interviews and collecting data for my work, for my book. Really thorough, comprehensive inquiry, which is only, even after 2 years' work, admits we are still just beginning. We're still just getting a sense of where we need to take this. But some really very important insights. Cambridge has done fantastic work on this, particularly in their Banking and Environment Initiative and Sustainable Leadership Program, particularly bringing together these notions of financial stability and environmental sustainability, environmental social sustainability, and how at a systemic level those two spheres need now to be talking to each other, and in fact not just talking but integrating. So very important work that has come out of that area. Here at our very own King's College London, Dr. Eloise Scotford in this very law school. 2 months ago we had an exceptional conference on climate change adjudication, to which Mr. Justice Blair referred. And that particular conference brought judges from all around the world and adjudicators from all around the world to discuss more and more the issue of climate change appearing in their courtrooms and asking themselves, well, what are we meant to do with it? How do we deal with it? And in a judicial scenario, and also in a way that sticks with courtroom values of neutrality, but may also have positive environmental outcomes. So that was a cutting-edge conference that happened right here. There's a wonderful entity called the Finance Innovation Lab based in London, which is a sort of a legitimate love child of Worldwide Fund for Nature and the English and Wales Chartered Accountants Society, a most unusual union. But they have come together and produced this thing called the Finance Innovation Lab, which is just doing fantastic work, innovative work in this space, particularly in relation to the notion of financial democracy, and getting previously disparate entities together to be able to discuss these issues in order to move forward. And then also, finally, there's a fantastic think do tank called Preventable Surprises, headed up by Raj Thamatharam, who has been in this field for a long time. And they have just put forward a proposition called Forceful Stewardship, really based on the notion that investors, and particularly very, very large institutional investors, so think of your pension funds, for example, can start getting very active in this space. They don't have to be passive. They can actually start being really active in relation to those that are managing their money, and the boards that are managing the companies, the targets of which their money is getting invested into. So this is all just happening in the UK, and there's more. There's more. So this is the place to be talking about this. And just across the channel in the city of love and light, we are currently, as I speak, the opening night of the International Climate Change Talks, as Mr. Justice Blair has pointed out, is taking place. So the agreement to agree. What happens from 2020 onwards? Very important and highly uncertain at this time. But certainly in those discussions, added to those discussions is the limb of private finance. So what does all this mean? What all this means is that right here in this room, right now, at this moment, is an exceptional time to be discussing these issues and to be asking these questions and to be thinking about the kind of questions between finance stability and environmental sustainability, and how essentially that could be a monumental lever in moving forward on the issue of climate change. So this part of the evening is the intention is to be discursive, it's to be engaged. I mean, essentially you're sort of in your church pews in front of me, but I think we can get a little multi-directional very soon. So to help us get multi-directional, I have two expert practitioners. So to my right, I have Claire Herons, Chief Operating Officer of ShareAction, and I love Claire's background. So her first degree is in engineering, and she also has an MBA. She's practicing management consulting. Her first sustainability role was at the Carbon Trust in 2006, and she was CEO of Carbon Leapfrog, which brings her to ShareAction now, this year. So Claire brings a meta-level analysis, that kind of meta-level skill, but also that nuts and bolts, practical approach of what is actually happening on the ground. So we are so honoured to have Claire. Welcome, Claire, please. To my left, I have David Cook from ClientEarth. Dave started life as a financial lawyer and then got into sustainable consulting. And particularly in that role was involved in predominantly carbon accounting and strategy, which is so important. I've worked particularly with accountants before in the space of what we call socio-environmental accounting. And carbon, accounting for carbon, the auditing associated with strategy around it, business strategy around it, is key to particularly any kind of trading system or even evaluating or assessing one's portfolios as well. So his role in ClientEarth brings together those two strands, particularly looking at legal levers in relation to disclosure requirements around climate change, which is incredibly pertinent given Mr. Justice Blair's comments in relation to disclosure, which are coming out of some of these high-level reports now. We're going to circle back to that. But for right now, please welcome Dave. So the idea is that we're just going to kind of shoot the breeze, get a bit of a rhythm happening, and then when we've managed to do that, we're going to throw it open for question and answer so that we can actually start discussing what's been happening up here with the rest of the room. We may not be able to answer all your questions, I'd be surprised if we can. This area is happening as we speak and it's still shaping, it's still being shaped. But my hope is that we need to be asking the questions and that when we walk out of this room we have a little more knowledge and a lot more curiosity around these issues than when we walked in. So I'm going to ask the first question. And I'm going to ask it to Claire. Claire, can you please tell us a little more about ShareAction, your role there, and how that fits into this discussion of finance and climate change?
Okay, yeah, I'll give that a go. I don't know if I should do it Gangnam style, but the noise out there. I don't know what they're doing out there. They're probably using a hell of a lot of energy though. So I come from an organisation called ShareAction. We're a charity. We're actually the Movement for Responsible Investment. So, and funnily enough, we started 10 years ago as a movement. We were actually the USS campaign. So the USS being one of the biggest pension schemes in the world. It's the academic pension scheme. I'm sure everybody's been involved in a bit of change there over the last few months. And 10 years ago, there was a campaign to make it adopt a more responsible attitude to the way it invests its money. And that's where we started. Now, 10 years later, we're still having at the USS campaign. We've actually got a meeting later this week, and we've made huge progress. And I would put it out there that if anyone wants to know about that programme, we're actively recruiting people to help us with that. But over the intervening 10 years, our model has evolved. It started from the premise that if you're investing money, you have a hell of a lot of power. There's about $67 trillion of money invested as equity in the world today, and that's a hell of a lot of leverage if you're trying to make the world a better place. So responsible investment is the whole social climate shebang. We find it very difficult actually to separate those two things. And what we exist to do is to harness that power. And we do that in three ways. We work quite systemically with the financial system itself. So I suppose on the inside, we rank pension funds, we look at what's good and what's bad out there. We do a lot of research and we do try and influence policy and regulation. So, very, very involved in influencing the Law Commission around redefining fiduciary duty. Less successful last week with DWP, but we're working on them. That systemic change is great, but it needs power to make it happen. So the movement for responsible investment is about harnessing the people inside the system, so the people who actually want to make a change and sometimes are a bit constrained or there's a reward for them in taking action, but also the savers, so people whose money it is that filters through into this nebulous system that gets invested that ends up in all sorts of impacts that they have no control over. So we actively, more like a traditional charity, get people involved in trying to influence that. And then finally, we demonstrate the change we want to see. So we have projects we call unlocking projects. So we'll pick a topic and we'll champion it. and we'll mobilise that set of investors. We'll mobilise all the tools at our disposal, and we'll try and make the change happen. So for the last 10 years, we've been operating towards something that we now call green light, which has led to recommendations, particularly around pension funds, and we will just go and sit on their doorstep until they talk to us, and we take a very pragmatic view and say, you know, you need to understand what's going on in your portfolio, you need to understand the risk that that represents, and you need to start taking some action around it, because otherwise it will bite you. And it, gratifyingly or horrifically, depending on how you want to look at this, we've been right. You know, we've seen millions wiped off pension funds over the last few months in bad investments in coal stocks. We've seen organisations penalised for their impacts on the environment, but it's not quite enough yet. So we're being vindicated gradually and people are taking action, but it's very, very slow. And I think it stems down to, and I suppose the challenge for the debate is huge short-termism. The whole system operates. I mean, I think there was reference to, you know, the timescales around climate change. I think I heard just a few weeks ago in a presentation an ex-banker saying, you know, sometimes, you know, he as the manager of the team would think almost maybe a month into the future, which was, you know, a privilege that he had as the manager, whilst his team maybe, you know, were 3 or 4 days ahead. So it is a very short-term timescale, and it's completely incompatible with what we need to do with climate. So I will leave it there.
Thank you, Claire. No, we'll come back to you. So well, let's pick up on that topic of short-term versus long-term, and I think that's really important, Dave, and certainly that notion, that disconnect between timeframes is just something that keeps coming up again and again and again as a barrier to mainstream action. How does disclosure, or does it? Well, first of all, tell us what disclosure is. What is it that the company ought to be disclosing? What are the relevant, we're talking about risk disclosure, what are those risks? And then maybe how is that going to help bridge the short-term, long-term divide?
Sure. Well, as Claire was saying, investors should be making appropriate decisions in relation to preparing their portfolios for climate change. That is all completely predicated on a flow of information from companies to investors. Moreover, that information needs to be actionable as well. It needs to be packaged in a way where investors can incorporate it into their decision making. We're all, you know, the science is no longer in any credible dispute now. Climate change is a risk for companies. That risk will manifest itself in different ways for different sectors, but pretty much it's a pervasive and significant risk for all sectors. So in terms of precisely what the risks are which need to be disclosed, that will depend on the sector and indeed the individual companies in that sector. They'll be exposed to us differently.
But we're looking at what? Physical risks? So in other words, wild weather damage to assets, devaluing assets? Are we looking at that?
It's pervasive. It's everything from physical risk to infrastructure to supply chains. It's regulatory risk from the increasing regulatory burden.
Yeah, supply chain's important actually. That came up in the UNEP inquiry as something that is not often considered. So that's important. Regulatory risk, I think, is my understanding is it's the hardest risk for firms to mitigate. So being the idea of what policy shifting.
Policy shifting, yeah. I mean, the effect is of, the sort of most significant impact of regulatory risk is basically changing the economics of business models. Right. So certain business models are no longer economic.
Yeah.
There's a clear direction of travel in relation to climate change policy and legislation, and effectively, although the precise letter of the legislation may not be known now, in terms of adapting business models, preparing for the worst, etc., that sort of risk-based approach to scenarios, that's the sort of thing which companies should be thinking about now.
Yeah.
I've got a lovely example on the supply chain side, which was a carbon trust example. So, you know, I say none of this ever comes from a place of, you know, you should do the right thing as a corporate. It always comes from a place of, if you don't do the right thing, it will do you, even if it's slightly longer term, it will do you financial damage because you're not looking after your business. And there was a lovely example that PepsiCo was wanted to look at its supply chain and started really examining and picked on Britvic Orange as an area that they were going to drill down into their supply chain, and it was a real kind of brand thing. They were very chuffed that they were going to footprint their product, and it was one of the first products that was ever carbon footprinted. But when they drilled down into it, they found that the orange trees that they relied on were actually in a floodplain. And, you know, this was supposed to be a sort of measurement thing that was going to give them a footprint and make them learn lots of things, and maybe they could save a bit of money and get some brand recognition. And it turned into quite a business critical thing because they suddenly realised their whole supply chain ran the risk of going underwater if there was a climate impact.
Wow.
So it was a real example of measuring something and finding out a real business critical risk that nobody would have predicted had they not done the analysis.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's important. I think those risks. I mean, certainly the work that I did, the key motivator was risk aversion, downside prevention. So the business case that Mr. Justice Blair was discussing, that idea of risk return, and that you want your returns outweighing your risks. You want to be mitigating these and elevating these, but that a business case can essentially comprise both soft factors and hard factors. The soft ones are really hard to quantify, but it can be elements such as reputational damage or reputational elevation by being a leader in the space. It can relate to retention of staff. So soft factors are really important, but they don't get as much attention because they are harder to measure. So, and that brings me back to the sort of carbon accounting thing, Dave, that it's a mantra of the accountants that I know, that what gets measured gets managed. Was that your experience when you were in practice, that importance of measurement as an instigator of action?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the measurement itself is a means of changing a corporate culture so that these sort of issues are at the forefront of people's minds. So there's that aspect of measurement. There is also it always throws up surprises in relation to where the hotspots are, where are the most impactful areas of any business's operations or supply chains. It's sort of, I guess before you sort of start the endeavour, it seems sort of intuitive that a certain area will be the most impactful. But it's only after you've gone through a rigorous sort of data collection exercise, you've possibly had it audited or validated in some way, that you then realise that actually where the hotspots are, and more importantly where you can actually direct efforts at reducing emissions, that those are revealed. So measurement is good for the company. I think there is a huge number of empirical studies to say and demonstrate that what gets measured gets managed. That all adage. But at the same time, the reporting of that information to investors is another key part of the puzzle.
Exactly.
And it's that flow of information which allows investors to incorporate these sort of decisions into their investments.
Yeah, no, I think that's actually crucial, and it must be crucial because, essentially that's where the UNEP inquiry, that was one of the key recommendations, was around disclosure, and particularly this notion of enhanced disclosure. Mark Carney, as Mr. Justice Blair mentioned, Governor of the Bank of England and also Chair of the Financial Stability Board, had this discussion with the Financial Stability Board very recently in relation to how do we see these systemic issues of climate change and financial stability meeting, and where it met, at least as a very beginning point, is in what he has termed effective disclosure. So we have enhanced disclosure coming out of the UNEP inquiry, we have effective disclosure coming out from the international body, the Financial Stability Board, and also the Bank of England. The obvious question, though, is, and I'll ask this of both of you, the obvious question is sufficiency of disclosure. And you just touched on this just then, Dave. So there's disclosure, and then there's disclosure that actually is useful to those that are reading reports. So, for example, there's been plenty of disclosure in relation to executive remuneration, but I don't know that that's actually solved the problem. So what does sufficiency mean to you?
Yeah, I think this is a complicated issue to deal with. It's also different in different jurisdictions. For example, the SEC in the US has issued guidance on how climate risk should be reflected in corporate disclosures. We don't have any such disclosure, any such guidance in this country, or I'm pretty sure not in the EU at the moment. So also there's obviously the issue that different companies will need to report information differently. I think the key sort of requirements, guidance is needed to articulate precisely what is required to be disclosed and how to do it. But also the other sort of piece of the puzzle, I think, is that how that fits into the normal reporting framework. There's a movement in this country for clear and concise reporting, which on the face of it sounds very a good way of doing it. It's only information which is pertinent is disclosed. But the danger is that if companies report information differently, that sort of works against comparability, and you need to be able to compare between companies in order to make appropriate investment decisions. So I think there's lots of aspects to sufficiency of disclosure which go beyond the actual content of what is disclosed, if that makes sense.
No, that makes perfect sense. I think actually it is quite interesting because even despite the guidelines, the SEC guidelines in the US on corporate reporting, Ceres, an NGO based there, actually did some excellent work on having a look at the quality of reports that were submitted consistent with the guidance in relation to climate change. So in other words, disclosing material risks to the company that are born from climate change related issues. And Ceres found that most of those reports were not of sufficient quality, and that the SEC was not following that up. I think 3 letters particularly were issued to relevant companies in just 1 year, saying essentially reports aren't up to scratch, even though the volume of reports that weren't up to scratch far exceeded that. So Claire, in your role, in terms of working with policy, because we have this kind, so we've got practice, and then we've got policy or regulation in place. Sometimes they work together, sometimes they don't work together. How's your experience of that relationship?
Oh, which particular hat should I wear at this stage? I mean, I used to work for an organisation that was funded by government. I had to be terribly polite. These days, less so. I mean, I think if you look at what has happened in the world, where there have been big step changes, generally we've had to regulate to get those, and I think we have to be honest about that. And there is this sort of interaction between the private sector and government where we have a prevailing wind at the moment, and maybe that, this is what's different in China, that we are letting markets decide everything. Our policy mantra seems to be about letting markets decide, and unfortunately markets tend to decide things that aren't necessarily in our long-term good or that of the planet. So there's been some good success where industry has actually stepped up to the mark and almost given permission to policymakers to act. So there's some interesting dynamics there. But I think where there has been a mandate to report, you get a bit more consistency, etc., etc. But it's a slow old process. And I think where companies have then said there's a benefit in us reporting, we can access cheaper capital, or we can get some brand equity, or what have you. You've tended to get sort of these big step changes in what comes out. But the industry alliances have been good. Yes, my personal view is that we need regulation really to underpin a lot of this stuff. The short-termism of markets compared to the long-term nature of this issue means that something has to bridge that gap, and that can't entirely be a private sector thing, but just by definition. But there's a huge role for the private sector in understanding the business and the opportunity. It's very interesting. I remember a conversation with somebody, with one of the big engineering companies, I think it was Now, who sort of said, look, if you regulate, we'll complain, we'll lobby, we'll make a big noise about it, we'll try and get you to reverse it, and then we'll go and innovate and we'll make money. And I think that can be the role, and I think the institutional investors, if they can sort of push some of that thinking, you can actually push innovation through industry. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I think they're uncomfortable bedfellows, this sort of private sector driver and regulation, because regulation is often held up as a restrictive force. And it is quite difficult, but most of the markets that we need to influence, we call it an energy market, is something so highly regulated really a market? So there are some tensions there, and I think we have to be honest about it and hit those up front.
I think in terms of disclosure as well, there's certain sectors where companies can tie their performance effectively to their reputation. So, for example, the Unilevers of this world, where their environmental stewardship is very much related to their bottom line, effectively, to their revenue generation. However, for every company like that, there are also much more secretive companies that don't want to disclose information that need the a regulatory obligation in order for them to do so.
But this is where you can use management. So one thing we haven't mentioned is beginning of this year, we filed resolutions against BP and Shell. Very successfully and quite challengingly, with 98% of the investor vote behind it. So there were some challenges about whether they went far enough. But that put onto those companies a need to report.
What were those resolutions, Claire? What were the details?
They were made. Thank you for that. I'll pass that one to Dave. There were 5, and email me if you want the details. But they were basically about the company reporting on its actions.
So I think there were you're right. There were 5 sort of separate heads. One was in relation to stress testing their portfolio to different energy demand scenarios for the future, and that's the key one really, because in the past lots of companies have predicated their future demand on the most favourable IEA scenarios. That which isn't appropriate. There were other heads were around sort of R&D, what was being doing there in relation to low carbon technology, KPIs for executives in relation to how they did or didn't incorporate sort of climate sort of related considerations. So various other sort of
suite.
There's a suite of different metrics.
And I think that was done in a very kind of very high level. If you just left them to it now, they would get away with murder. It really wouldn't do a great deal, but it gives you a basis on which you can start pushing. And we're putting together expectation documents about what we'd like to see out of that. And I think actually Raj has done a lot of work on this idea of a 2-degree business plan. And the evolution of this is that you start asking these organisations to properly plan. There's been a lot of scenario stress testing, which is how would we react to this happening to us, and maybe a bit of selectivity about which metrics you use and how you define those scenarios, but it's a move in the right direction. But ultimately we want these companies to be looking into the future and saying, what are the risks and opportunities into the future for us as an organisation. After I did an MBA and I thought Shell had invented scenario planning, so they really ought to be able to do this, and they ought to be able to. And if you're making them look out through the business planning life cycle, they're looking naturally a lot further ahead than they would normally on a day-to-day basis as an organisation. So you start getting this, and if you can get them to publish it, you could get transparency around it. Maybe we can start sort of shifting mindsets a little bit.
Great. Beautiful. I love the idea of a 2-degree approach, actually, to assessing, a 2-degree budget, emissions budget to assessing loan portfolios for investors as well as banks. And on this note, I actually want to throw it over to the audience for questions, and we'll see if we can answer. And there are some specialists in the audience as well, so I think comments as well as questions. So let me throw, yes, up the back.
Hamish Stewart, I'm a consultant at Otter. My question is about the reporting standards and metrics around carbon and climate risk for the banking sector, because they don't seem very proactive in discussing standards and disclosure standards as a sector. And I'm Canadian, and there's not been a public statement by a Canadian bank, and a substantive statement on climate change at all. So are they waiting to take standards from NGOs or CDP, or are they engaging in public policy engagement quietly and trying to set a standard? I mean, how do you think the banking sector in Australia or here is positioning itself with regards to the standards development?
The Canadian bank's really interesting, and in fact, the think tank Preventable Surprises recently published a very good report around the status where Canadian banks are at vis-a-vis climate change. The conclusion of that report was that the Canadian banking system is trailing behind other jurisdictions in the world. Interestingly enough, when I did my work, I was looking particularly at leading banks. I wanted to be interviewing banks that were really putting themselves out there as green leaders, and that had business practices and services to back up those claims. Not one Canadian bank was on my list of leaders, and I cross-referenced reports at the time to come up with the list. It was not a subjective thing. So I personally, I would have also I looked at those lists again just last year, and there were still no Canadian banks leading on this issue. I cannot tell you why, but there is certainly, I think, traction around it now, with other jurisdictions moving ahead. So Australia, UK, US. That the good thing about kind of hanging back a little is that Canadian banks now have a number of other successful precedents that they can base their business plan on, and their evaluations of their own carbon intensity in their portfolios on.
If I could add to that a bit as well, is that I think actual standards development in the sustainability and environmental space is quite a sort of there's a myriad of issues related to it, I think. But in relation to banks and their portfolio, carbon risk, etc., the greenhouse gas protocol is currently sort of consulting on a methodology for banks to use. And I think what's interesting about that organisation is that actually, whilst it is an NGO, it is the sort of authority on these sort of issues. So it sort of slightly nicely sort of bridges the gap almost between an industry consortium developing a standard versus an NGO. It sort of can sort of sit on the face between those sort of sometimes opposing positions.
Yes.
Hi, I'm Desiree from the Climate Disclosure Standards Board. I have a reference from much about banks and unbearable carbon. It's from the Australian Centre for Corporate Responsibility. It was published in October 2014. It offers a very good methodology for how to approach this financial aspect of capital allocation. I have a comment here and there and two questions. We can't soften the tone of this time because we cannot solve really the current predicament with innovation that comes from a business as usual scenario. And it is David is saying that standardization is key. It's exactly what we need. We need the leadership at the regulatory level because the consistency will determine the value of the disclosures. So it's great to see that risk value drivers in the investment analysis are starting to be embedded weakly in some, by some analysts, strongly by others. But I happen to have just been to a supply chain risk event here at Somerset House. Probably 80 corporates and legal experts and some journalists here and there. And they were asked to simulate what would preempt future risk across the supply chain. Most people in the audience were trying to dodge the legal bullet. And now, okay, how are they going to face the cannonball coming from systemic risk? So eventually somebody brought to the audience the issue of value. We need to change culture and values. And that's key because the corporates will only look at what's my cost, what's my legal risk. And apparently there was a journalist who said that the current CEOs that are brought into power are brought with the least level of responsibility about and capability about how to manage risk. So one question is about, okay, how can we influence the value creation discussion, because it's key to any carbon accounting, because if we don't change values, we will not embed the externalities in our accounting, and we need accounting at national level, because international trade is huge, so if we look only at our domestic impacts and footprints, we want to be able to have any meaningful decision making, whether government or private level. And so value creation, but also Megan, this is especially for you, what do you think about the trend in non-binding law? And so we are increasingly seeing all these regulations that are not binding, in the degree of flexibility and interpretation, like the SEC's pilot. It was great. The SEC's asked for embedding climate risk into the strategy disclosures, but then it was an interpretive guidance. So this lack of prescription, again, is not driving any change at the pace that we needed.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry for the length, I apologise.
It's good engagement. Dave, would you like to kick off?
Yeah, so value creation. I mean, to my mind, effectively, this is a short-term versus long-term issue. At the moment, and this is possibly a sort of legacy issue, because I don't think there's anything in either in sort of legal frameworks which requires it currently, but there is a definite preference for short-term value creation. But I think that steps are being taken to change that mindset. The new, well, it's not new anymore, I keep saying the new Companies Act 2006, but it's a long time ago. That has changed the requirement to promote the success of the company, whilst that previously was a sort of interpreted in the short term. Now there is a requirement to have regard to the likely consequences of any decision in the long term. So effectively, it's making trying to shift the emphasis from short term to long term. Also, in relation to much of the sort of non-binding law, there's also sort of various sort of provisions there which try to sort of shift towards a more long-term mindset. The UK Corporate Governance Code now has a requirement for directors to provide a long-term viability statement in their annual report, and that's supposed to give an indication of the viability of the company over the long term. That long term is supposed to cover investment planning periods. So that's just an example. Those are sort of two examples of what I see as attempts to move away from short-termism to a more long-term view, or at the very least to negate any requirement to consider the short-term preferences as more important than long. And the UK Corporate Governance Code, that is a non-binding, compliant explained piece of frameworks which should nicely move into. Are you able to talk on the non-binding law?
Yes, I am able to talk. Why not? I got the question, so yes. Right, so thank you, Dave. I agree with everything that you just covered. Non-binding regulation is important. It has an important role to play. Those who deal in the space of public international law know that as much as those of us who deal with private actors and corporate actors. It has a place. It is an important kind of buy-in tool. It's an important norm-setting device, and it's often an important first step to setting hard targets in place. Now, there are risks involved in that by having a soft law framework, that there's room to move and to not actually really do anything, yeah? But it tends to be, and Mr. Justice Blair mentioned this, particularly in this space, reputation is key. Reputation for finance actors is key. And signing on to even a soft non-binding agreement has important reputational repercussions. So that is important. Then there's gradations of regulation. Then you can have regulation that's promulgated by regulators or by government through legislation, which is what we would call nudging regulation, steering regulation, which is incentives and disincentives, but it's not what we would call hardcore command and control. And in this space particularly, I'm a huge fan of nudging regulation. Incentives in terms of financial incentives, so feed-in tariffs, tax credits, even grants, for example, and then command and control, or a carbon price would be in that, but that's a disincentivizing piece of legislation. And then command and control, thou shalt not. That's essentially what that is, that kind of legislation. There's a role for that. But in something as dynamic as climate finance, that's changing, all the time, and we're creating it. We are creating it literally as we speak. I think there's room for other approaches other than thou shalt not. So yeah, but we need to go in with our eyes open. Do you have any? Should we take another question and then we'll get Claire involved? One more, says the Dean.
Actually, possibly just on that point about the non-binding law. In some ways, whilst it's non-binding, it can still be enforced in the sense that if companies have signed up to a framework but aren't sort of acting appropriately in accordance with it, there is still a regulatory oversight of that. For example, of the Corporate Governance Code, but there's also the Stewardship Code for institutional investors. And whilst it's not a legal obligation in the strictest sense, it's still an obligation which can to some extent be enforced.
Can I just add on values? Just one last thing on value creation though. I think this is why we pick pension schemes as our target as an NGO, because if you're a pension scheme, you may have somebody today who's joining your pension scheme at the age of 17, and you have to ensure their financial well-being when they retire, and that might be, well, I mean, what's that going to be by the time they get there? Probably 85 or something. But you're probably still making very short-term investment decisions. You're still following the norms of the industry. But you need to start lifting your head above the parapet and say, how is that person going to be impacted by some of these issues? So I can say to the people in this room that have a USS pension, your pension is invested in cluster munitions. And you might go, oh, that's not great, I don't really want to be associated with that. What we need to do is have the same reaction to some of these climate impactors that, are going to kill people, are going to do horrible things, and are going to threaten the financial viability of that pension in the long term. So we've got to drive some of that thinking through, and it's a good place to start, because if these guys aren't looking far enough ahead, They really ought to be. And that's right.
Thank you. One more question. Yes. Thank you.
Fergus Green from LSE. I've got a question about state investment banks, particularly state green investment banks. We haven't really talked about that much tonight. So, I mean, clearly the private sector has the most investable capital, to use a phrase that we used before. And obviously, if we can mobilise the pools of private sector capital into a low carbon economy, we'd be, much further than we are. But historically, if you look at the analysis by Climate Policy Initiative, which analyses every year the sources of low carbon finance historically, it's state institutions, particularly state green investment banks or those by another name, that provide, if not a majority, I know the numbers, Megan, but at least a plurality, like the largest single source. So the state is actually doing a lot more than the private sector. Mariana Mazzucato has written a lot on this too. So, I just wondered if you could comment on where that fits in, and insofar as we can't shift the private sector through changing risk-return profiles and business cases, are we going to need to rely more on the state?
Yeah, so, I mean, the focus of my work is particularly the private actors, for all the reasons that we've discussed so far. But state actors, and particularly state bank actors, are absolutely key. And as Mr. Justice Blair mentioned, those notions of private and public partnerships, I think, are incredibly important. That's not going to go away anytime soon. It's just very challenging, I think, because there's so many levers here that could really be pulled. And it's so complex, there's so many different strains involved in terms of policy, in terms of private, in terms of state, in terms of partnerships. And we need all of them. We need all of them. They all need to be brought to bear on this issue. So you've raised a very valid point, and yes, it needs to be in play.
I suppose on that one, the difference where this has worked is the different role that the state plays. So, maybe rather than providing finance, underwriting and recognising risk profile. And, I think way in the early days of the Green Investment Bank, there was the Green Investment Bank was supposed to mop up some of the risky bits of the market in order that then the private sector could play a little bit more cleanly. And there's a role in aggregating some of this because it's a very different profile of asset. You're going from a very centralised asset to a very decentralised asset. So governments recognising that and providing the financial stability to underpin the private sector and allowing the market then to pick up is, I think, a role that's been played. Possibly Germany is a good example, I don't know. But where that's worked, that's been really, really successful. Where it's just been the government trying to play the role of the private sector, Green Investment Bank being a case in point, has not worked quite so well, I think. Do you agree with that?
Sounds good to me.
Why?
So I've had some really highly successful students in my life, and people ask, well, what'd you do? And my basic remark is, I get out of their way and let them go about what they're so good at. And Justice Blair congratulated us on hiring Megan. I think actually our task is to facilitate Megan and then just let her go. And I learned a lot from all of you tonight. I learned a lot from all four of our speakers. I learned a lot from Megan's two hands. As they came together, they emphasized what's important in the world. And what I would like is that we all bring our two hands